Fantastic.
So we're sitting in a room, and we'll repeat that with a beautiful Rembrandt next to George and a stunning Picasso next to Helena. I can see Tom is logging in. Hello, Tom. Wait just for a little bit for everybody to have time. Hi, Pamela. Welcome. So basically what we'll do today is that we'll do a Q&A. Hi, Hazel. Hello, hello.
Hi, Hazel.
Works. I like that. I like the fact that you can see everybody. Hi, Hazel. So Hazel has been working on the culture program as well with BFAMI. We've had an amazing year. So hopefully we'll be able to return to those trips we've done recently.
We're all missing trips.
Sorry, George.
I was saying we're all missing trips. We all look forward to traveling when we can.
Yes, I think it will feel quite good.
Well, then, in my case, I have actually been traveling, but never mind.
Although I like this. Look, you're both in London. I'm in Brittany. I'm in the Château Le Guénolé, the Relais Château. It's not bad. It's really not bad.
Oh, look
at you.
Wow, look at you. Yes.
It's a really nice place, and that could not have happened in the world before. We would have had to be in the.
And we just now took these two magnificent works off the wall of the public exhibition to bring them through. So it's quite special sitting here with them.
It's very special. It's very generous, and again, I mean, I'm sure people will be missing them for a little short while in the room, but we're very appreciative of the fact that you take them out of the wall for us. So thank you very much. Again, we can't touch them anyway, but it makes a big difference. What time is it? 1:02. Just like a few more minutes, as I can see that lots of people are logging in.
Great.
And
then we'll start. Well,
you can't see this, but we're actually surrounded by Damien Hirsts. Damien Hirst walls.
Yeah, well, I think many of you know this room actually, because we've hosted coffee mornings and talks live here. So you remember the room, and we hope to welcome you back here soon. Exactly.
Any chance I get to go there, I'll do it anytime, even without a meeting.
And we're sitting on beautiful chairs from the Invisible Collection. You know, Anna's.
Anna's
Yes. She's dressed our rooms. Yes, I don't know whether she's logged in. Hi, Anna, for that.
I haven't seen her yet. Maybe.
I don't know where they are.
Well, people are getting excited. Two masterpieces. Start. I know it's very. Let's be British about this. It's 1:03. I'll do the very short of Israel, and I have the pleasure of having Helena Newman. Helena, you know BFAMI really well. You're a member of BFAMI and have been for quite some time, and you're also the chairman of Sotheby's Europe and worldwide head of Impressionist and modern art. And you're sitting next to the Picasso, which is next to the Rembrandt, and next to that is George. And George, Gordon, you're the co-chairman of Old Masters Worldwide at Sotheby's. And a little bit of background about myself, I'm a journalist. That being said, we thought it would be a very good idea to put those two masterpieces together. And they look like they don't have anything in common. Different times, different artists, different styles, different everything. The only thing they have in common is that they'll be sold on the 28th at Sotheby's during the evening sale. And the more we looked at them, the more we thought that they had interesting connections and relationship. So maybe starting with the obvious and the background for the people that don't know these works, maybe we can start with the oldest. The Rembrandt, dating 1631, and it's a
1632.
32. I'm so sorry, 1632. 32, absolutely. 31 is the we're looking at.
Well, we're looking at a self-portrait by Rembrandt, painted, we can say, not just in 1632, we can say from the last few months of 1632, because in the autumn of that year, he changed the form of his signature. He used to sign before that RHL monogram, Rembrandt, Harmonsohn, son of Harmon, Leidensis. But right at this moment, he was in the process of moving from Leiden to Amsterdam, which was then, and still is, the largest and most successful city in the Netherlands. And so you can see that Leidensis wouldn't fit. So he started to and awareness. I think he must have been aware that if he became famous, and he wanted to become famous and successful, he would use his first name only, as he would have been aware Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and others had before him. He was not a modest man, he was an ambitious man. And we know that, but he changed the form of the signature again early in 1633. Up until this point, he spelled his name without the D, so Rembrant. And this strikes people as a little odd. That's how this one is signed, but in fact, that's how he signed his name, or his name was written in Leiden up until that point. The question should be more painted wet, what we call wet in wet. In other words, the paint of the signature is impressed into the background paint, which means that we know that it was painted very quickly, but perhaps we should come on to that later.
Yes, I think we'll come back to that. So next to that painting, and again, we'll go to scale, and that small scale but grand pose, we have a Picasso that has a bigger, much bigger composition, and yet much more intimate. So maybe, Helena, you can tell us, who is this femme endormie, the sleeping woman?
Okay. So 299 years later, so 1931, is this magnificent Picasso of Marie-Thérèse. So the story of Picasso's love affair with the then 17-year-old Marie-Thérèse is quite, famous and told many times over. Of course, it was the subject of that. At this point, the love affair with the young Golden Muse, as she was known, is still very secret. And there's something about this work that I think is incredibly intimate, and I think it's to do with the technique. And I'm devastated you're not all here to see it, because really it is incredible. It is executed in charcoal on a prepared canvas, or what's known as a primed canvas. So it's a very, very fine, almost like a linen canvas. And it's interesting. So why didn't Picasso just take a sheet of paper? Brittany, just years earlier, with this very famous, wonderful sketchbooks. But I think it has kind of a bit more depth and richness, and a sort of velvety texture to the ground that adds to that intimacy and gives this kind of quality of gravitas and timeless to the Renaissance, also back to artists like Ingres, to Picasso's own neoclassical period of the 20s, but it's also rooted in surrealism, which is just that moment of his surrealist works, and that it has a timeless beauty. Absolutely superb.
Maybe what we...
Looking at it here, from where I'm sitting, it looks absolutely wonderful, as it does on the walls of our galleries. But what is remarkable about it is that without seeming to try, he manages to convey a sense of depth using just the chalk, no colour, and a neutral ground, even though there isn't actually much depth within what depicting. Without seeming to try, and in a work that's actually, if you analyse it, very linear. And I think that there are similarities with Rembrandt in that regard, because actually from here, the backgrounds look remarkably similar. There are very subtle modulations of light and a little bit of colour, but hardly at all, in the Rembrandt background, which he painted first before he painted the figure. And one has the same sense here with the Picasso, that there is an understanding of recession and bulk, even though done effortlessly, without any of the usual tricks of the trade.
Is maybe the purpose, what we could, here we go, what we could imagine the purpose of these paintings was. For example, for the Rembrandt, we were discussing that maybe this could have been intended as a CV sort of portrait to send to his future in-laws and wife to be. And Picasso, as a sort of like reverse thing, is something that was very private. It wasn't signed. It was not maybe intended for anybody but himself.
Yes, I mean, Picasso,
yeah.
Like George has mentioned with Rembrandt, Picasso is also extremely self-possessed and extremely ambitious amongst the old masters, as well as, you know, the legacy of the future. But actually, in this instance, it's actually a rare moment of him, you know, this self is less present, and it's about, you know, it's a private moment. He's captured a private moment, and when you look at it, you sense that intimacy, like, you know, and he kept this work with him. It was part of the estate in 1973 when he died. That's why it's not signed. And so that you know, when we look at it now, this is the first public viewing this work has had since the 80s, when the present owner bought it. So it's been a work throughout its lifetime that's remained partially open. She's in a sort of state of half sleep.
There is a real contrast, because that's a very private painting, but it is about love. If that,
yeah, of course.
Rembrandt, as we know, is best known for his self-portraits, and they really do migrate from being self-expression and self-projection early on, from several years before this one, to the late works, which are much more self-examination. I think that you could say that both of these works are private in one sense, in that Rembrandt is not revealing much. He chose to paint himself in formal dress. This is one of only two self-portraits that he painted where he's dressed not just formally, but actually very expensively. Both of their portraits, formal portraits, are from the same year, 1632. The other one's a little earlier because of the form of the signature that I mentioned before, and is in Glasgow, although not on view, alas. He's painted himself this way principally because he's on the cusp of enormous commercial success, moving from being a history painter in Leiden to being a portrait painter in Amsterdam, which sounds an odd thing to do, but history painting is not regarded, but there's this immense demand for portraits from the newly wealthy, and there were very many of them. How a sitter, a client, might expect to be portrayed by him, although never on this small scale, but also as a man who is successful and wealthy and confident and sure of himself. And the exception, of course, is that when you look at his face, he's probably doesn't appear all that confident. He's a little reticent. He's keeping something back. He's holding something broad by what was about to happen, or what he hoped was about to happen. And of course, we used to see Rembrandt in fancy dress. In the earlier self-portraits, he's often wearing, where he's working out ideas for history paintings, he's often in character, certainly in form of expression, but also in terms of what he's wearing. And later on, he paints himself in all sorts of kit from the dressing up box, really for sale, because that's what people wanted to do. They wanted to buy a self-portrait of Rembrandt. He became a brand, and they became a sort of example of his brand awareness. Here, he's in between those two phases, and I think that's why he.
Yes.
Both these artists were extremely self-willed, and whereas the Picasso is a work that comes out of love, unconditional love,
and hidden love as well.
Always loved himself more than anybody else, and that's very cruel. Not here to answer back. So
that's exactly it, Helena. Maybe you can. I mean, that point between this self-examination and self-projection, the tension in the work of Rembrandt, it tells a lot also in Picasso's work, because that's a pure.
Yes, I mean, I think that's what surprises people a bit when they see this, because we're used to seeing Picasso with layers and layers of emotional intensity, you know, whether it's the weeping women of Dora Maar, or you know, the 50s and the 60s, you know, there tends to be, you know, right through every decade, elements of Cubism, even when it's not Cubism. You can't say that in this work. You tend to have more complexity in much of what we know, even by the time you get to 1930 on canvas of that year that we all, as I said, saw in that show, I think at Tate, you know, Le Miroir, Le Rêve. There's a lot more layering of meaning, and here it's just pure, and that's quite arresting. And it doesn't last long. I mean, it's literally just in this moment and a few others. It's pretty rare, because by 1932 he has a big exhibition at the Galerie Georges Petit in Paris and in Zurich, and that is when the public and his wife, Olga, he's still married to Olga at the time, realised that there is another woman on the scene. And it's clearly another woman with the, you know, aquiline profile, you know, everything, the blonde hair, you know, it's clearly another woman. So this is just a short window of private love and passion, and that then, as it evolves, of course, becomes more complex. And people say that you can look at Picasso's career and you can sort of punctuate and define the various styles through the women he was with at the time, and so this is on that turning point, and it's about to come. Marie-Thérèse are somehow present, but here it's just uniquely her.
It's the hidden relationship and the beauty of it. How much of a scandal was it? 1932, and there was a beautiful retrospective at Tate last year, when all these pictures are revealed, that this hidden protected love becomes public.
Yes.
How much is it a scandal, and how much will Picasso ever dare to come back to something so intimate?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think he certainly had to deal with Olga's wrath, but being Picasso, I think he just carried on regardless.
That's exactly what Rembrandt would have done. Exactly the same.
But again, Rembrandt did it on purpose.
Yes, all about creativity. I mean, I think the other thing to point out is that this is the work that somehow combines three of Picasso's great media and technique, because he was a great draftsman. He did some amazing sculpture, particularly in the 30s, when you think of those great plaster in this particular work. So, you know, it is very much his essence, but in a rare moment of purity.
I was being a little unfair to Rembrandt, perhaps, because there are drawings of Saskia, which are incredibly intimate and full of love, and paintings of the informal paintings of Hendrikje, for example, the one in the National Gallery, which are also very intimate and spontaneous, but also full of love. The formal studies of Saskia, the formal portraits and Saskia side to Rembrandt, but we see it more in the drawings and some of the informal paintings. And I think where he was painting himself until the much, much later, 20, 30 years later, the late self-portraits, I think he didn't regard himself as up for negotiation. It was self-projection and yes, obsessive self-depiction, but they don't become, he's not investigating his own character at this stage, or if he does, he lets a little bit slip, but not too much.
But can we say at the end of the day that these two paintings, despite what we might think are about love, but one is about loving another person and the other one is about getting ready to receive love, like as a pitch, basically a CV to convince that he's worthy of love?
Yes, and there is a theory that I gave a number of reasons why he might have painted this portrait, and certainly there is undoubtedly a connection between them. Around this time, he met Saskia Oudenberg, who was the cousin of Hendrik Oudenberg, with whom he was going to business in Amsterdam to paint portraits, who became his wife, to whom he became betrothed. And at this date, late in 1632, Rembrandt was either in Leiden, I don't think he painted this in Amsterdam, or he was actually in The Hague, where he was painting portraits of friends of his, in some cases, but figures associated with the court. And Saskia was, for some of that time, in far off Leeuwarden in Zeeland. And there is a distinct possibility that he actually painted it for her as a keepsake. We don't know for sure. We don't know for sure when they actually met. But if that's the case, it will also have been. So there will have been a dual purpose then to present himself to Oudenbergs in general, Hendrik, and also Saskia. But we have to speculate on that. It's fun to do so, but Rembrandt always keeps something back. The more you learn about Rembrandt, the more you learn that there are things that are hidden about him.
I find the size quite incredible. I mean, I know it comes out of that sort of genre of miniatures in a way, and as you say, maybe it was made with a view to, magnitude, fitting the composition. And when we think of the large-scale Rembrandt portraits, in a way the composition wouldn't be any different, would it? But then all in this small scale, and it's even more captivating in a way.
Well, it is very small. I'm pick it up in a minute so you can see, but it's painted very, very quickly, probably in the course of the day or maybe 36 hours. And we know that because Rembrandt always laid in the background first and left what we call a reserve for the figure. And he then signed the painting, but when he signed it, it's wet. It's into the still wet paint of the background that he painted first. The scale, it may seem surprising, people have said so, but in fact, most of the self-portraits, not all, that he painted before this, and he'd been painting self-portraits for about 5 years already, are actually on a very small scale, either on small panels or on copper plates, such as those that he would have used for making etchings. And the portraits that he painted of friends in The Hague, of Jacques de Guyne, that's the portrait that's normally in Dulwich, are now in the exhibition in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which will reopen to the public on August the 10th and will be forming a queue. Are actually, they're bigger than this, but they're not a lot bigger. They're small scale, they're about this size. which is much smaller than his formal portraits. And this painting is linked very closely to those two. Firstly, because all three of them were friends, and in fact, the two other portraits were in panel, which is Baltic oak, and the best panels were from oak sourced in the eastern Baltic region. And the portrait of the Maurits Huygens are on oak panels which come from the same tree. We can actually tell that. This probably would have been a bit of an off-cut of timber, but I would imagine that Rembrandt received a consignment of oak. We haven't found any others, and if we did, we might be able to be. Even then, we're only an hour apart by horse, so it's pretty nearby. So this painting is really closely bound into Rembrandt's.
I mean, there's so much obviously to talk about the two, but I want to make sure we have a bit of time for Q&A. So the last point that I wanted to bring with the both of you is, well, the fact that you're both here and we decided to do this talk with two masterpieces as opposed to maybe, you know, one and the other. And beyond the fact that they're both in the same sale, under 28. And just to give an idea, so Picasso, the estimate is 8 to 12 million pounds, and Rembrandt is 12 to 16 million pounds. So beyond the fact that we know that people collect and live and approach artworks, and can you talk about, is it something that people have changed and they're now okay basically to live with contemporary and antiques and things being mixed up? Or do you think auction houses, by merging the departments, have understood how people collect and changed how it's provided to the public? Yes, 6 to 9. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, and but actually, before we talk about the new collectors, this it's one of the highlights of a group of avant-garde art that we're offering altogether, 18 works. So that in the evening sale, and then a further 40 or so the next day, or the 25 or so the next day. So that's interesting in itself, because it also gives you this collection. We've titled it the European Avant-Garde, and it's led by this Picasso, the Léger Contraste de Forme, the Giacometti bronze of the woman, a standing Kandinsky, Feininger, Macker, Lipchitz, also gives you in Europe. And this was bought from Gallery Bayerler. The Léger Contraste de Forme came from Bayerler. Quite a few of the works came from galleries like Marlborough and Waddington, the kind of leading European based galleries at the time. And that was an era when you could still get great material by those key classic modern artists and build a collection of that depth. I mean, now it's really, really hard to the 20th century in one auction. So that's the first point I want to make, because it's a kind of window back into a world of collecting of 30 years ago, when this kind of material was you know, was still possible to acquire. I mean, when this Picasso was bought, it came directly from the family. So basically it passed through the estate. And can you still hear? Is that okay?
Yes.
Excuse me for interruption. And then it passed through to the present owners. So that's one point. But then moving on to the context of the sale, I think that it's great to have it together, actually, George, isn't it? It's a really nice opportunity that this whole disruption in the market from COVID and the calendar and everything afforded, and people have responded incredibly well.
They have.
Yeah.
First of all, this has been huge fun to do. I mean, it's really stimulating and exciting, but it does in a more continuous way. They don't divide it up into different categories of, you know, old masters, 19th century, etc. Particularly where the better-known artists are concerned. So we noticed, for example, there's a very beautiful Frans Hals portrait in the this sale. We noticed that when we have had Frans Hals portraits in recent years, they've often been pursued and often bought by people who've been collecting art of the 20th and 21st century. There's a very, we've seen this across the board. People have a different view of the past. And we think that actually in terms of the intellectual approach to the creation of art, there is possibly a bigger gulf between the sort of what we might call the classic contemporary art produced in the post-war era and cutting edge contemporary art, and there is between Rembrandt and Picasso.
Yes.
They belong together. Really.
Yeah.
They look happy together.
They
Yeah, they do look
very
happy together. Really
George and I look very happy together.
Yeah.
So, in a way, it encourages that mixing of categories as well, doesn't it? And that's always been the case. It's not actually new. I mean, we have had work with collectors in common for years now, who've been looking for the best of the best across hundreds of years.
One of them just called before we started to do this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So that's not new, but I think also you're absolutely right, Maïa, that new collectors coming into the marketplace don't actually come with any particular preconceptions on, what they want to be looking at, or certain art historical boundaries. So that favours this kind of presentation.
To a big extent, and we've noticed this over the last few months when we had to rely more on the internet to sell art by various means, and we discovered that in fact we were getting interest from people that we didn't know or we didn't know in our own areas. It just happened.
Yes.
It's been due for a long time, and it's happening now. I personally, being in my bonnet, I think that contemporary art and old masters, and the reason why this possibly wasn't successful initially is that various museums tried it, and it seemed a bit as if it was being done by a committee rather than being done with a real aesthetic sense. And actually, once you allow the natural connections between artworks to breathe, they happen and they're successful, and they don't jar and work perfectly well. And that's true of the exhibition we have out there now, where these two works will soon return. The Rembrandt is sitting on a wall and you can look.
And see Bacon.
Exactly.
And the Bacon can see the Frans Hals.
The Bacon and the Frans Hals are actually looking at each other.
It's really cool, actually.
And immediately behind the Rembrandt is an amazing Ellsworth Kelly, which I adore. So there you are.
So go to the virtual tour on the website and you can see it. It's incredible.
Yes.
It's really lovely to see.
It's actually quite nice. Just so people know, I've opened the comments now. If people have any questions or comments on the works or on whatever else is I mean, it's pretty amazing to have you two at the same time. I feel extremely lucky. Both specialists. And so if anybody wants to say anything now, the comments will come on. While people are typing or getting ready to say anything, maybe you can let us know about other works that you think are maybe very important in this. I mean, yes, I know there's quite a lot, and you have. I mean, it's Rembrandt to Richter, so it's quite like a large span of art history. But is
20th century and modern France. Obviously, the sale is pegged by the Richter 4-panel cloud painting from 1970, which is magnificent. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. The Bacon of 1970 of John Edwards, and then one of my absolute favourites in the sale is the beautiful blue Miro. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look on it, but it's today the blue of the Mediterranean. And
yes, the happy blue.
And yes, and the blue of Yves Klein, and it's got that kind of intensity of colour that is magical. That you see that there's one in the Pompidou of the same palette. We saw 1 year ago, actually, that it was called L'Étoile Bleue, that made it still record price for the artist of $37 million. So it's very, very, very excited to have that. That's a real museum quality masterpiece.
Well, I think, I mean, if there's no more questions or comment, the selling, the sale, sorry, the evening sale is on the 28th, so Tuesday evening. So this has been extremely, extremely interesting and very lucky for us to have both a Rembrandt and a Picasso and the two of you in the same room. So on behalf of BFAMI, thank you, Helena. Thank you, George. The BFAMI cultural program series continues. We'll have Yinka Shonibari next to Sotheby's and have a look